Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this panel discussion on the Sustainable Development Goals and Mine Action. My name is Leonie, and I'm going to be facilitating this session from the Conflict and Environment Observatory. We're a UK-based charity working to reduce the harm to people and ecosystems from armed conflict and military activities. We have just an hour for this session, but I know we're going to hear some really interesting presentations, and I'm sure we'll also have a useful Q&A session afterwards. So please post your questions for the panelists in the Zoom Q&A facility, and we will come to these after the presentations. And you are welcome to use the chat function to add any general points or comments. I should also just make you aware that the event is being recorded, and please, if you could keep your microphones muted, that would be great. So that's it for housekeeping. Now I'll just briefly run through the agenda, which incidentally doesn't include gender mainstreaming, despite the makeup of the panel, or the makeup on the panel for that matter. Sorry, I should have banned myself of jokes today. So we're joined by 4 panelists today. My colleague Lindsay at the Conflict and Environment Observatory will begin with an introduction to the issues and a look at the current situation. Tracy, who joins us from the USA from TR Climate, will then give us some insights into challenges and opportunities with examples from outside the sector. She will be followed by Kendra from Norwegian People's Aid on organisational mapping onto the Sustainable Development Goals. Angela from the Geneva International Centre for Humanitarian Demining will finish the presentations with a couple of case studies on linking mine action to the SDGs from Angola and Jordan. We'll then move on to the Q&A session. So a reminder to use the Q&A function if you have a question, and please highlight if the question is for a specific member of the panel. Lindsay Cottrell is the Environmental Policy Officer at CEOBS and is working with Norwegian People's Aid on a 3-year partnership on environmental mainstreaming and mine action. Lindsay is a chartered environmentalist and previously worked in the environmental consultancy sector for over 20 years, specialising in contaminated land, auditing and environmental risk assessment. She has worked on a broad range of industrial, commercial and defence sites, including a large portfolio of UK Ministry of Defence sites. Over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you, Leonie, and thank you for joining us today. As part of this introduction, in the next 10 minutes, I briefly want to address the following 4 questions. So, how are SDGs relevant to mine action? Why should we care? What has been done to date, and what practical steps do we need to take? So, why are the Sustainable Development Goals relevant to mine action? So, there are 17, all of which have a set of targets and indicators. And to paraphrase, for the environment, they aim to support the protection of the planet from further degradation, so it can support current and future generations. So a healthy environment brings social and economic benefits, and it's remembering that people and the natural environment are interlinked. The SDGs are not perfect. They can be seen as top-down, bureaucratic, one size doesn't fit all. They're not legally binding, and there's a lack of data to measure and manage them. They can't be achieved by government alone, and it needs all of us to contribute to implement them. But with the benefits of each goal, there is the potential for an organisation to have both positive and negative interactions with these. So there's a need to ensure that any negative effects are managed and minimised. So if your organisation has not mapped this, you won't be aware of what these are. So why should we care, since humanitarian work is already being delivered by the mine action community? It shouldn't be regarded as a nice to have additional extra, and it should be the core responsibility of all organisations, all businesses and all governments, following the do no harm principle and going beyond that. The SDGs, as I've mentioned, are not binding, but with the 2030 deadline to achieve the goals looming, there's likely to be increased expectation and requirements will get stricter, and there's still a lot to do. As an example, the Measuring Up report in 2018 by UK SSD found that the UK itself was falling well short and was only performing well in about 24% of their relevant targets. The majority of the others were ranked as either inadequate, poor, or there was no data. So there's a reputational issue if you're not to be seen to engaging and not achieving the potential of better outcomes for all on a large scale. And on a local organisational scale, you're going to be more attractive to donors if you can demonstrate alignment. So you may hear referral to direct or immediate and indirect, medium and long-term links with SDGs. And mine action typically focuses on immediate results, and it's important to be aware and contribute to the longer-term goals. And this means flagging the links early. It's very difficult to retrofit sustainability. And the last point I wanted to make is the importance of partnerships, that working together and with others, there's a greater collective impact. The importance of collective action, this links with some research that was just published last week by the UN Environment Programme, which makes the point of the need for more integrated approaches to tackle climate change and biodiversity loss. So some examples of what has been happening. GICHD and UNDP in 2017 report highlighted how mine action enables sustainable development and why further mapping was critical to demonstrate its relevance and its links. And Angela later will be explaining some of the further work that GICHD have been doing since 2017. There is more discussion and dialogue about the SDGs. For example, Bosnia and Herzegovina in their submission for Article 5 extension request this week mentions SDGs. And then also there's the informal draft of the Lausanne Action Plan, which now includes the need to support achievement of SDGs. And also, I also wanted to highlight two projects which UN Afghanistan are submitting for funding, and thank you to Ayoub Alavi, the Environmental and Sustainability Consultant for UNMAS Afghanistan, who presented these at our last Environmental Issues and Mine Action Working Group meeting. So one of these is in Kuldara, which is about 40 kilometres from Kabul, where Mine Action will be supporting the wider flood and upper catchment management scheme. And the second one is also an upper catchment management for the Koli Hashmat Khan protected wetland area just south of Kabul. And that will be incorporating sustainable land management such as grazing and pasture management. Then you'll be hearing about more examples later from MPA and GICHD. So some detail on some practical steps. These will be outlined by the other presenters later, but I just wanted to give some here as well. The importance of understanding and mapping the SDGs. How does these relate to your activities? Focus on the relevant SDGs. What is the goal really about? So that means looking at the targets and the indicators as well. How is it relevant to what you actually do in terms of both your direct operations and also the supply chain and goods and services that you rely upon? And how do you impact that goal? Is it positive or is it potentially negative? How you engage with your stakeholders and what their requirements are? And how are you going to measure this? How are you going to ensure that you've achieved what you wanted to achieve and met your targets? And also, once you've focused on the relevant SDGs, don't forget about the others, because they may become more relevant in the future if perhaps your operations change in some way. So there are, as well as utilising existing information management systems and platforms like the Mine Action Intelligence tool Mint, which allows for the setting and tracking of key performance indicators, there are some other free tools out there which can be, which have been developed to help businesses contribute to SDGs, but may also be useful. So I've mentioned here as well. First of all, there's the SDG Compass, which is again designed for multinationals, but others are also encouraged to use it. So that allows you to understand them, set priorities, set goals, and then undertake reporting. There's also a Action Manager tool, which is a self-assessment tool, lets you picture what your strengths and weaknesses are within your organisation. And then there's a resource centre, which provides articles, guidance, and information on tools and other events. So that's the end of my introduction. I hope that was useful, and thank you for listening.
Please. Tracy Baschek has, for over 20 years, shaped science-based climate change and sustainability policy and partnerships through her consultancy, TR Climate. She currently advises multiple global Fortune 500 companies and foundations on delivering their climate change goals. For over 10 years, she served in the United Nations, including under Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, advising on climate action and climate security. She also served on his high-level panel for global sustainability and contributed to the development of the Sustainable Development Goals. Over to you, Tracy.
Thanks so much, and I hope you can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Terrific. That was a great opening, and thanks so much for having me. So I'm glad to be speaking today on SDGs in Mind Action. And specifically, I'll be talking a bit about measuring and collaborating for impact, bringing in some examples from outside the sector. I've been working on multi-stakeholder partnerships in different areas, and it was actually really difficult to pick one that would be most useful for you. If you came to mind, even on, for example, ocean negotiations, where they've been working really hard to bring language into negotiations around the SDGs, but we settled on transport. I hope it's very useful for you today. So there'll be three areas I'll be speaking on. One is on opportunities and challenges in your space, which you know more than anyone, fundamentals for impact, and then the specific example I mentioned. So for opportunities and challenges, the good news is you have some fundamentals for measuring environmental and SDGs that are already in place, or at least starting to form. So of course the IMAS, your articles that are in the CCM, some of them seem like they're requiring environmental impact statements around if they exist. So you have some fundamentals there. And then of course the SDGs that have direct and indirect. The complications there are that most of these are voluntary, they're fragmented, and of course they're primarily indirect targets. You have, the good news is opportunities, you have mandates, security mandates, environmental mandates, and multiple conventions, including national and transboundary water mandates. And then, of course, as we're talking today, the SDGs, which are unifying and cross-cutting. The challenges, of course, is that they overlap, they're complex, and then there's political sensitivities around where these mandates overlap. And then you have the global context, which is plus regional and site-specific context. The complexities there, or the challenges, are that there's resource constraints, there's data issues related to alignment. In particular as well with the SDGs, some of these targets are already due in 2020, 2025, et cetera, even though all the SDGs expire, if you will, are expected to be delivered in 2030. Some of the targets have earlier dates. And then capacity gaps for implementation, as well as we're talking now, the global pandemic and economic impacts that relate. So this is the big picture that we're dealing with. There is, of course, I always argue, a path for impact. And in every storyline, if you will, is different, but I'm proposing here that there are a few fundamentals for impact. And this list is going to look a little daunting, but it's not. So it's always great to have evidence-based or science-based and ambitious targets. The SDGs provide them, and I would argue that the good news is you have a few extra ones as well in your field. It's really useful to have champions and leaderships, groups that are at the vanguard and spearhead this work. You also have this, which is very, very useful. Socializing the language and the issue is critical to progress and move towards impact. So we can talk a little bit more about this, but if you expect an issue to be taken up within your constituency or a broader group, it needs to be socialized, basically. And engaging local and broad stakeholders. This is kind of, constantly spoken about within the UN and in this sort of work, but it is hard. It's a tough lift, but it's critical. And an implementation focus. So, and that goes without saying. MRV is not only within the formal world, it's increasingly within the informal world. And what I mean, I can give a couple examples about this within the transport, but not only within the SDGs, but there's sort of a shadow community of actors who are taking up the mantle of reporting against the SDGs, where the UN and other communities are failing to be able to report. Maybe data is lacking, or the capacity to report is there. And so there's this informal community is complementing that, and we can speak about examples, but this is actually quite helpful in the beginning stages as well. And we could talk a bit about that. And of course, investment in gaps, and this is where the UN and other international organizations can really help. And of course, allowing time and momentum. And I understand there's some really great opportunities in the next year to build momentum and in all of these areas, finding champions, socializing language, engaging stakeholders, especially around the this new declaration that's coming out and what have you. With all this in mind, it's always good to remember there's no size fits all. So I wanted to give one quick example of where this sort of pathway has been undertaken in sustainable transport. They similarly have a very complex world that they work in, with interministerial, many governments at all levels, global, national, subnational. They have to coordinate between various ministries, finance, industry in rural and urban areas. They have also indirect and direct SDGs that they report to. In the forming of SDGs, they fought very hard to have their own SDG. They couldn't get one, so they were distributed amongst 5 sort of directly, none exactly, and 7 indirectly. And they report against all of them. And they also have found, again, the SDGs that they report to, but they also have shadow reporting, basically groups that they have found benefit from reporting with. And then they have multiple coalitions that over time have formed, and we can talk a bit about that, where champion governments as well as NGOs, high-level NGOs, small NGOs, all different types have formed different coalitions, and I list some of them here to show you the complex space that was formed to basically, it started with PPMC and then it built over time, some of them with UN, some without, that built over the last 8 years, these coalitions that have really built up the space. And it took them a long time to socialize language, such that, and to galvanize around core issues that then kind of circled back, and they started thinking that they sort of knew what their issues were. And that was one of the issues why they couldn't come up with SDGs that reflected them. But then now they've socialized language. They say they, but I was actually part of this. And then settled on language that is their sort of their bells that they ring consistently, fundraise around, report against, and ramp up support for. And such that now policy, these are examples of policy mechanisms around the world that support them, such as low emission zones in cities, vehicle emission, vehicle registration laws, etc. This is just an example about how they actually, the reports, this is World Resource Institute using one of their others evidence, like they report, they support each other. This list of initiatives is 2 pages long of their coalitions against SDGs. If you look at the top, I just cut and paste a tiny bit of all of the initiatives that they work together on sustainable transport, and report to the UNFCCC on environment, SDGs, and transportation. And they've just really exploded in how much work they do. They have a high-level group at the UN. I actually helped to form that one. They have declarations and conventions. They meet globally. The next one is supposed to be in May of 2020 in Beijing. Got postponed, but they have declarations they continually push through the UN. And of course, they have work on the streets with coalitions of local grassroots organizations and stakeholders. So from being able to barely get traction in 2013, 14, they have just worked their they just worked so hard and really galvanized to get a lot of traction on the SDGs and environment sustainability. And now they have a reinforcing system of monitoring, reporting, that's formal and informal. They have a really broad stakeholder engagement. They've got deepening implementation. A lot of momentum has been building. It took a lot of time, but they have a lot of trust amongst each other. That it was a hard road, I have to say. It was not easy, including the trust part, because it was a tough process. But they've really gone far. And I think just to circle back, again, it took targets, it took champions, it took socializing language, it took a lot of stakeholder engagement, really focused on implementation was their goal. They had formal and informal MRV, and they really worked with who could invest in gaps to make sure that they met those needs along the way. There are other examples in oceans, et cetera, but I thought this was the most relevant. So thanks so much. Glad to take questions at the end. Hope it's useful.
Thank you, Tracy. Kendra, if you would like to share your first slide, please.
Yep.
Kendra Dupuy is Senior Advisor on the Environment for Norwegian People's Aid. Prior to that, she worked as a policy advisor and researcher on natural resource and environmental management in low and middle income countries for over 10 years. Kendra holds a PhD in political economy and has worked on projects in the mining, forestry and land sectors in countries experiencing and recovering from armed conflict. She has also worked on gender mainstreaming in mine action and development. Over to you, Kendra.
Thank you so much, Leonie. So I'm going to talk about an example of organizational mapping onto the SDGs, and the example is of Norwegian People's Aid. So let me first step back and talk about the little bit broader picture here about mine action and development, and why we should talk about the SDGs in the context of the mine action sector. So there has been increasing attention recently to understanding how mine action contributes to development outcomes. This is evidenced by recent reports on this topic that have been authored by UNDP as well as GICHD. And there is donor interest in this as well, for instance, from the FCDO, former DFID. And just to piggyback off of Lindsay, in terms of why we should think about the SDGs and development outcomes in the mine action sector, this is because it can be helpful to help us think about how we can bridge the humanitarian development gap. This can provide a foundation for sustainable peace and development. And as I'll argue throughout the rest of this presentation, mine action is directly relevant for the SDGs. So to give you this example of how Norwegian People's Aid engaged with the SDGs, we carried out a mapping exercise during this past summer, where we mapped what we believe our contributions are to each of the 17 SDGs. So the method that we used was self-assessment. We asked our country programs and head office staff about whether and how NPA and its programs contribute to each SDG. We asked our staff to rank these contributions to each SDG from 1 as a minimal contribution to 5 as a high contribution, or alternatively to say it was not applicable. We found that in some way we contribute, our mine action programs contribute to each SDG. And our programs reported contributing the most towards 2 SDGs in particular. This is number 5 on gender equality and number 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions. We reported medium contributions, and medium is not a very rigorous measurement for the moment, but yeah, so we'll stick with it for now. But medium contributions to SDG 8 on economic growth and employment, to SDG 15 on life on land, and to SDG 17 on partnerships. We asked our staff not only whether our mine action programs contribute to SDGs, but also how to think about a theory of change, or what Tracy called a path to impact. And to give you a little bit more here, so in terms of how we contribute to SDG 5 on gender equality, our staff pointed out that we mainstream gender into all program activities, and that we employ women in administrative, operational, and leadership positions, which then further contributes to combating harmful gender norms, creating role models, and empowering women. In terms of how we contribute to SDG 16, we do this in a number of ways. We help to reduce the risk of injury and death from explosive ordnance and the illicit sale and trade of explosive ordnance. We discourage corruption and bribery. We support governments in the establishment of competent and accountable mine action authorities through our capacity development programs. We encourage adherence to international humanitarian norms and principles, and we help to facilitate peace processes. So a few recommendations based on this exercise for how mine action stakeholders can contribute to and map their contributions to and trace their contributions to the SDGs. So first of all, we need to do more systematic mapping and perhaps consider developing tools for guiding organizations in how to do systematic mapping and even visualize those results. We can do this through capacity building and training. And we also need to, along with the example I showed before, clearly think about how we contribute or developing a theory of change. We need to think about mainstreaming or integrating the SDGs into mine action planning and programs. And this may entail, for efficiency reasons, that we focus on fewer SDGs. We need to, along those lines, then think about including and integrating the SDGs in monitoring and evaluation and reporting so that we can clearly and systematically measure progress over time and space. This would help us to clearly provide evidence, systematic evidence of impact and causal attribution. Third, we could do more to enhance awareness among donors about the need for enhanced financing for development-focused outcomes in the mine action sector. And finally, we need to encourage and engage in partnerships between mine action and development actors. That's it for now. I'll conclude there. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kendra. Angela, if you would like to share your first slide, please. Angela Hoyes-Ibora is an external relations and policy advisor at the Geneva International Centre for Humanitarian Demining. She provides advice and training to both the GICHD and its partners on policy-related topics, particularly on the links between mine action, peace, security, and development. Previously, Angela worked with the United Nations Regional Centre for Peace, Disarmament and Development in Latin America and the Caribbean as a legal officer and advisor for the Non-Proliferation and Arms Control Programme. Over to you, Angela.
Thank you. Can you hear me properly? Yeah. Well, good morning, afternoon, and evening to all. Thank you, NPA and CEOBS, for the kind invitation to present the SDGs efforts to support this sector in linking mine action and the 2030 Agenda. As mentioned by my predecessors, the 2030 Agenda and its SDGs provide a comprehensive framework for the mine action to demonstrate and measure its role as a key enabler for sustainable development, but also for humanitarian action, peace, and security. The 2030 Agenda and the SDGs have the potential to support mine action in promoting more efficient, effective, and sustainable outcomes. For this reason, my presentation has two main objectives. On one hand, increasing the familiarity with the 2030 Agenda and its importance for the sector, and on the other hand, providing some practical insights on how to better connect or align both frameworks. To this aim, I will present some of the existing initiatives or efforts under the SDG Mine Action portfolio within GICSD. The 17 interconnected SDGs are considered the results framework for the agenda, since they provide, sorry for that. Yeah, since they provide 169 targets associated and that cover the three core elements of sustainable development, which are economic growth, social inclusion, and environmental protection. Now, I think I won't take longer in this slide, since it seems that there's general agreement on the relevance of further linking mine action and the SDGs. But it's clear that beyond the humanitarian impact, explosive ordnance also restricts free movement and negatively affects the social and economic development prospects of the affected communities in the medium and long term. I think most of you are already familiar with this graph. In 2017, as mentioned, GICSD and UNDP conducted a joint study to assess the linkages between mine action and the SDGs and the extent to which mine action is contributing to the 2030 Agenda. This study found that 12 SDGs are directly linked to mine action and another 4 SDGs are directly linked. Now, the remaining question is how we can better link or align mine action with the 2030 Agenda. Here we have some options which are worthy to explore. Some actionable points include linking mine action with sustainable development outcomes, especially in terms of national mine action strategies, or using the SDGs as an analytical framework to conduct operational activities or monitoring and evaluation, for instance. Due to the time constraints, I will present the first points very briefly and will focus on the last one, the articulation of mine action contributions to the SDGs. In order to document contributions to sustainable development, it is critical to develop compatible outcomes and indicators. In the table, you can see a few examples for SDG 4 and SDG 16, but there are many others. Developing SDG-aligned outcomes and indicators will allow us to measure and potentially standardize impact assessment and reporting across the sector. As a second point, I would like to talk about policy coherence and increasing cross-sectoral synergies. In the slide, you can see two pictures from one of our workshops in Bosnia and Herzegovina under the joint UNDP-GICSD project for mainstreaming mine action into the SDGs at the national level. In this workshop, we brought together representatives from different ministries, the National Mine Action Authority, BHMAC, mine action operators, and other national and international NGOs and stakeholders as relevant. After the initial mapping in 2017, GICSD has continued its efforts to increase the evidence base about mine action outcomes in the field of sustainable development. In 2019, with King's College London and CIPRI, GICSD published a pilot study which used the SDGs as an analytical framework to illustrate the socioeconomic impact of anti-vehicle mines in Angola. This study was able to showcase the drastic effect of contamination on agriculture, infrastructure, and access to essential services, and emphasize the benefits of mine clearance across the SDG spectrum, directly contributing to 10 SDGs. I will take the opportunity to answer one of the questions in the Q&A function. For instance, in this study, even if it was out of the initial scope, we found out that as an expected consequence of mine clearance and land release, deforestation can happen if the beneficiary state does not have proper legislation in place for environmental protection. But moving forward and building upon these publications and efforts, the ICSD is finalizing a new case study that analyzes the contributions of mine action in the medium and long term in Jordan, assessing the impact of land release, victims assistance, explosive ordnance risk education, gender mainstreaming, and partnerships to leave no one behind. Based on the lessons learned from the Angola case study, we've made the analysis at the target level instead of at the goal level, which we found much more detailed and relevant for the findings. There is also an upcoming publication that explores the experiences of Lao, PDR, and Bosnia and Herzegovina in linking mine action and the SDGs, and this publication will be released next week. Today, I will present 3 concrete examples from the Jordan case study, where mine action has contributed to several targets that promote environmental protection and sustainability. These findings are still preliminary. I want to share with you for the first time some of the most relevant ones coming from this study. Maybe as a brief introduction to the Jordanian context, contamination in Jordan was mostly located in military control areas close to the borders with Israel and Syria. 3 areas were primarily affected: the northern border with Syria, the Jordan Valley, and Aqaba. In Aqaba, the Ayla resort stands in a former military area that presented mixed contamination and was demined in 2007. This project is a perfect example of how mine action through land release can contribute to regenerate and transform a military area to a prosperous zone while upgrading the overall environmental conditions. Ayla Resort comprises residential, commercial, and leisure areas and hotels, and was designed with a clear environmental dimension, which allows for several phases of the project to be powered by solar energy produced on site, as you can see in this slide, and also presents an innovative approach to water efficiency and green water recycling. Considering biodiversity as a key asset, UNDP supported the development of the Aqaba Ecotourism Development Plan to ensure coral reef protection and the conservation of nature for birds, since Aqaba is an important location for migratory birds with pelicans and other species stopping in this area. Therefore, land release has contributed to target 6.4 on water use efficiency, as well as target 6.6 on restoring water-related ecosystems. Also, in terms of conservation of marine resources, there's a contribution to SDG 14 on the use of the sea for sustainable development. In relation to clean energy, there's a link with targets 7.1, 7.2, and 7.3 on sustainable energy and efficiency. And additionally, land release has promoted progress towards targets 12.b on developing tools for monitoring the impact of sustainable tourism, and target 8.9 on promoting sustainable tourism that creates local jobs. Mine action has also contributed to target 9.1 and target 11.6 in this specific context in Aqaba. Now I want to present a second case in the Jordan Valley. Land release also contributed to many SDGs. For instance, date farms have been established in the former minefields, as shown in the slide in the picture. This has had a great impact in the local communities, since dates are one of the most water efficient and highly profitable crop according to FAO. Regarding the quality of land and soil, it is worth noting that former minefields were dried out, and land release contributed to target 15.1 on ensuring conservation, restoration, and sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, and target 15.3 on restoring land affected by desertification and drought. As you can see in the satellite images from the Golden Date Farm within the task in yellow, the environmental upgrade and the use for the agricultural use is quite visible in these images. Lastly, the third example focuses in the northern border with Syria, where mine clearance allowed for the construction of the Al Wida Dam. The construction of the dam provided irrigation for small-scale farming, contributing to many other SDGs. The dam was also conceived as a source of electric energy and enabler of tourism by enhancing the environmental conditions of the area. In this case, land release has directly contributed to target 6.4 on reducing the number of people suffering from water scarcity and promoting better and more sustainable irrigation systems. Regarding sustainable tourism associated with the environmental upgrades, linkages are found with targets 8.9 and 6.6 on restoring water-related ecosystems. Of course, given the current situation in the area, it seems very unlikely that the prospects for tourism are really happening right now. These are only a few examples of environmental outcomes of mine action based on our preliminary findings in the Jordan case study. Now, and maybe to conclude, I'd like to summarize the ICSD's efforts to support the sector in better linking mine action and the SDGs. We are currently providing support to strengthen the linkages between mine action and the SDGs at the national level in several countries, jointly with UNDP. We are increasing the evidence base about mine action outcomes in the field of sustainable development through new case studies. We've just received confirmation of funds to conduct 2 additional case studies in 2021. We are promoting dialogue and coordination across different sectors, such as today, for instance, and enhancing the practical understanding of the SDGs and their implications for the sector through a new training package that will be fully available in 2021. So with this, I want to thank you very much for your attention. Please stay tuned to our upcoming publications, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Angela. And thanks to all of our speakers for some fascinating insights and perspectives. So we have around 10 minutes for questions. Thanks to everybody who has submitted one. So we had a question from Silvia Catania. Could you please provide some examples of negative interactions with the SDGs? Can I put that to the panel?
I'm happy to touch on that. One of the thoughts I had related to that was not necessarily that it's negative to the SDGs, but possibly an onerous burden on governments to prove the relationship to SDGs and possibly beyond what is actually anticipated for the reporting system. So for example, you know, that not every SDG is expected to be reported against every year. And the targets and indicators aren't specific for, you know, I think somebody else flagged SDG 13, which somebody else is going to speak about. But I think, you know, not stretching beyond what is really expected for the SDG is okay. I think we need to really focus on what the SDGs are intended to, because if it's too onerous for the governments, there could frankly be backlash as well. The SDGs are focused on specific issues per one for a reason. And so it isn't as if it's negative per se, but they were honed in on specific issues for a reason, and the targets and the indicators were already so negotiated. It's good just to keep that level of focus. And there are other instruments to utilize as well. So while I know this is an SDG event, I just want to mention that I want to mention the SDGs are not, they're already nearly 200 indicators, but it's still not all inclusive.
Thanks, Tracy. Does anybody else want to touch on that?
Yeah, I'll just mention, because Angela already did in her presentation, about
a negative impact with respect to land release and the post-clearance use of that land. So whether there's mine clearance then opens that land to further vegetation, biodiversity impacts and deforestation effects. So it's understanding exactly how that development and land is to be used post-clearance.
Okay, thanks. So we've got a question from Yulia from Ukraine. When we're talking about sustainable mine action support system and measuring mine action contribution to the SDGs, should we focus precisely on mine action or broader disarmament, post-conflict and peace building activities? For example, if we should consider only stockpile destruction as a component of mine action or broader weapon and ammunition management, what is the most effective scoping and pros and cons for either approach?
I can take that one because I responded also to Yulia. So thanks for this question. First of all, Yulia, I think it's really important and a really good question. And what I've said in here and can elaborate a little bit on here is that I actually don't think it's either or, and that it really depends perhaps on who you're reporting or talking to. So that some stakeholders, maybe non-mine action stakeholders that aren't so familiar with the sector, it might be better to report on a broader goal. And that for a mine action stakeholder, then it might be better to report on a more tightly focused mine action goal, or yeah. So I think the, so, you know, articulating contributions to a larger goal can show the broader relevance. And if that's your aim in communicating mine action's contributions to the SDGs, then that can be really useful, as well as the longer term relevance of mine action, since we often receive very short-term funding. But I think the challenge, no matter what goal we decide on, is we have to have very clear indicators that, you know, precisely measure what we're contributing towards. And then we need to make sure we can collect data on that indicator and consistently over time and space. So, yeah, so no real clear answer, I'm sorry, but I think this is a really good question here. So that's it for me, thank you.
Thanks, Kendra. Would anybody else like to pick up on this question? Okay, I'm going to go on to a question from Sebastian Kasak. This is around Sustainable Development Goal 13 around climate action. So this is maybe a question for Angela. According to the UNDP GICHD study, this was not linked to mine action. The official wording is take urgent action to combat climate change and its impacts. I would challenge this and say, can we address its impacts through mine action?
Well, thank you very much for the question. I tend to agree, especially after having looked at the different contributions to SDG targets that aim at fostering environmental protection. So in a way, there's a contribution to climate action, but what was showcased in the study, especially looking at the targets under the SDG 13, is that this goal encompasses and addresses also kind of multilateral efforts and global efforts to promote frameworks that prevent climate change and what it's called now and foster climate action. So maybe that's why it was a bit difficult to establish also a direct link with this, but based, for instance, on the different SDG targets related to environmental protection, it could be argued that, yeah, there's a connection. However, I'm not an environmental expert, so I don't want to get into very specific discussions on this topic, but for sure there's value on having an extra look at it. And I want to take this opportunity to mention that the ICC UNDP study was a preliminary or initial mapping, but as mentioned also by my colleagues during the presentations, there's a need to conduct these mappings also at the national or even local level, because each context will provide different answers and different impacts depending on a lot of external and internal factors that happen at the same time as we go as mine action sector. So I don't know if I'm answering fully, but I hope so. Thank you.
If I can add a little bit here, clearing of mines, if it was to increase the resilience of a community, that could add to SDG 3 in an indirect way. So it wouldn't necessarily reduce emissions, but if it was to enhance the community's capacity in some way, their adaptive capacity in a community, you know, their decrease their vulnerability for in their community, to say like they're, yeah, in their, by the way they can live, for example, if they can expand where they live, they're no longer in they're in less of a vulnerable area, then their resilience is increased. So that would be, I think, indicator 3.13.1. So that would be an indirect increase. Yeah, that would be an indirect impact. So that would be one. Yeah, but I would say, yeah, not necessarily related to the emissions.
Okay, thank you. We're almost at the end of the session now. So big thank you to all of our panelists there. I'd just like to say, if this session has stirred an interest for you and you're not already involved, there's a working group on environmental issues and mine action, which you are welcome to join if you work in the sector. The next meeting is on Tuesday, the 1st of December. And if you're interested, contact either Lindsay or Kendra. The contact details are on this last slide. There's also a LinkedIn group which you can join. So a huge thank you for everyone for joining us today, especially our panelists. Let's keep up these rich discussions. Thanks also to the implementation support unit of the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Convention for letting us host this side event. Okay, many thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.